As the 19th century came to a close, the Denver and Rio Grande's narrow gauge lines in Colorado and New Mexico had settled into the role of feeder lines to the railroad's standard gauge. The narrow gauge hauled ores, coal, lumber, oil, farm products, and general merchandise. They were an important source of revenue. The railroad had begun to replace much of the rolling stock with new and larger cars as the smaller freight cars wore out after years of toil trying to keep up with the increasing traffic demands. Locomotives, however, were another matter. The DR&G had not purchased any new narrow-gauge locomotives since 1887. The older, smaller engines still in service struggled to manhandle the freight and passenger traffic over the line's 4% grades and 24-degree curves. It was common for trains to require 3 or 4 of the Class 400 280s just to move 100 tons of freight. In 1901, the Denver and Rio Grande Mechanical Department sought a remedy for this problem. They solicited design specifications for a locomotive of a size and capacity to handle at least twice the tonnage of the 280s then in use. Early in 1903, the railroad selected Baldwin Design Specification W4213 and ordered 15 locomotives. They would be assigned road numbers 450 to 464. These locomotives would be nothing like anything yet built for American narrow gauge. They were outside frame 282s with Vauclane compound cylinders and sloped back tenders for better visibility. Compound cylinders were in vogue at this time as they were supposed to provide smoother running and more fuel efficiency. The new locomotives were designated as Class 125. In preparation for their arrival, the Denver and Rio Grande began laying heavier rail on many of its lines in anticipation of the first locomotive deliveries in April of 1903. While they were being broken in, it was observed that the new engines had a tendency to waddle as they moved down the track. They were soon given the nickname Mud Hen after the coot duck, which had a similar gait. In 1906, the railroad converted locomotive number 458 to a simple engine by changing it to 17-inch by 22-inch cylinders with D-slide valve system steam chests and valves. This experiment was a tremendous success, and by January 1912, all of the remaining compounds, except number 456, had been changed to simple engines. Additional improvements were made over the next 3 years, including adding a second air pump, flange lubricators, electric headlights, generators, and new spokestacks. In 1918, new, larger rectangular tender tanks were fabricated in the railroad's Burnham shops. All the while, the Mud Hen's operating territory continued to expand as further track improvements were made on many of the narrow gauge branches. Starting in 1923, the Denver and Rio Grande began to apply piston valves and Walschaerts valve gear to the Mud Hens as they rotated into the shops for repairs and maintenance. As they emerged, they were given the now familiar classification of K-27 class. Over the next few years, all of the Mud Hens were upgraded to the new cylinders and valve gear, as well as new cross-compound air pumps and boiler tube pilots. Between 1927 and 1928, superheating was added to the K-27's repertoire. Many trainmen with experience on both the narrow and standard gauge lines considered the superheated Mud Hens to be the finest riding and running engines on the entire Denver and Rio Grande system. With the beginning of the Great Depression in late 1929, the Denver and Rio Grande Western narrow gauge was hit very hard. Many of the K-27s experienced long periods of inactivity. In 1939, the 4 Mud Hens that had not received piston valves and Walschaerts valve gear were cut up for scrap. That same year, the D&RG traded number 455 to the Rio Grande Southern for Ditcher 030. That left the D&RG with a total of 10 remaining K-27s. In December of 1941, numbers 458 and 459 were sold to the Nacionales de Mexico, dropping the roster to 8 Mud Hens. World War II brought a flurry of activity to the narrow gauge. The K-27s were put to hard use as all of the remaining 8 locomotives were in service almost daily. When the war ended in 1945, business on the narrow gauge began to spiral downward again. The end was in sight for many locomotives on the system, including the K-27s. Slowly, one by one, the mud hens succumbed to the scrapper's torch, until only 2 remained. Fortunately, they are both with us today. Number 464 operates regularly on the Huckleberry Railroad in Flint, Michigan. Number 463 is on the Cumbres and Toltec Railroad in her native Colorado and New Mexico.